Welcome to the HDG Stories podcast, where we'll share our threads of memories, knowledge, experience, and history, knitting all generations into a beautiful tapestry. So please like and share, and be sure to subscribe. Now let's get started.
Hi, this is Ellie. Today's podcast is an excerpt from the full-length interview with Robert Carson. Bob is a well-respected local attorney, born and raised here in Havre de Grace. If you've only known him through his legal profession, I think you'll enjoy this podcast. Welcome, Bob.
All right. It's Bob Carson. I'm talking to Ellie Menser. I was born in the house that was located where Harvard Memorial Hospital is now. A picture of that house is on the first floor of the hospital today. Two pictures are. And that's where I was born on December 16, 1935.
Now, are your parents from here?
My mother was born in Carson's Run in 1908. She was a twin. My mother's name was Ella Catherine Carson. Her twin sister was Nora Elizabeth Smith. Her twin sister preceded my mother in death and would have died around 1978. My mother passed away around 2000. She was 93 years old at that time.
You have strong genes in your family.
Mm-hmm.
And your dad?
My father, Omer L. Carson, and everybody called him Jack, he was born in Olney, O-L-N-E-Y, Illinois, in Richland County, Illinois. His father remarried following my father's mother's death and moved to a small town called Selma, S-E-L-M-A, California, which is south of Fresno. And that's where my grandfather lived. He remarried. He married second wife, whose name was Ethel, was my grandmother's sister, as I recall.
So how did your parents meet?
I don't really know. They were married in 1934, about a year before I was born.
How did they end up in Havre de Grace?
Well, my father had moved here, and he was working for the Havre de Grace Republican, now known as the Havre de Grace Record, and he was selling copy for that newspaper. He later went into dry cleaning and had a number of dry cleaning plants, and he went into real estate and insurance. He had a real estate business called the Maryland Company, which had its address in later years at 301 St. John Street here in Havre de Grace. His partners in the Maryland Company were a local attorney, G. Arnold Paffenbach, P-F-A-F-F-E-N-B-A-C-H, and Senator Millard Tidings.
Do you have siblings?
I have one sister. Her name is Emily Elizabeth Carson. Everybody calls her Betty. She presently lives in Annapolis. I do not have any substantial contact with her. I may talk with her or see her once or twice a year.
What are your earliest memories of your own childhood?
Well, when I grew up, we lived at 567 Congress Avenue, which was a row house that was owned and managed by, I think his first name, I forget his first name, but it was Mr. and Mrs. Burns, B-U-R-N-S. They lived on the end unit toward St. Patrick's. This row of row houses was just to the east of St. Patrick's. And I remember living there. It was a relatively small row house. We had only 2 bedrooms, as I recall, on the second floor. And when my sister was born, my aunt and I, my Aunt Livy, lived with us in later years, from about 1940 41 on. And we shared a bedroom upstairs on the third floor in the attic. My recollection, it was somewhat cold. We moved to 812 South Union Avenue. It would have been about 1947 or 48 when I was in the 5th or 6th grade.
Since you were on Congress Avenue for quite a while, do you remember what you did as a child, playing, early school, anything like that?
Well, I remember going to elementary school, which was right down the street. It's across the street. The elementary school then was across the street from the high school, and is where there's a big auditorium there today. And that's where the elementary school was that I went to. My class would have been the first graduating class that had 12 grades. Up until then, there were only 11 grades. And there were a number of people that I went to school with whom I remember, and a number of whom I have contact with today. Alan Fair, for example, shared a double desk with me in the 4th or 5th grade, which I recall quite clearly. Joe Carreri, who's passed away, his parents owned the Carreri Food Market. His brother, John Paul Carreri, was mayor a couple of terms and on the city council. Joe, Monty Silverstein, whose father owned Joseph's department store, Captain Harry Jobs. All of those were, I think, in my class. If not, they were within a grade of me.
I was going to say a double desk with AJ. Now that sounds like brewing for trouble. Do you remember what you did for play?
Well, I remember I played baseball or softball when I was in elementary school. They had ball diamond adjacent to the school, which had been on the Huber side of the school. And I remember that I had friends who visited me at home, and we played at home also. We used to play marbles, played ball. And I remember that I started fishing when I was in elementary school. I later continued that in high school. And I went duck hunting when I was in high school.
So you've been an enthusiast for the outdoors pretty early on.
Yes, and we lived in the summer, starting about 1945 or 46, in a house in Charlestown across the river in Cecil County, which my father bought. And indeed, he later bought a number of houses that were adjacent to where we lived. And we lived there in the summer for 4 or 5 years at least. And I had a couple of small boats and outboard motors, and I ran those boats. My father was not much of a navigator. He let me take care of the boats. I remember that Madison Mitchell carved decoys back then, and when I went duck hunting with Senator Tidings, the first time I ever went duck hunting, I went with him. He had a number of Madison Mitchell decoys. I don't know whatever happened to them. They were kept in a shed out at Oakington, which is where he and his wife Eleanor lived and their son Joe. And later when I went duck hunting with Donald Mergler, who was much older than I was, he had Madison Mitchell decoys. His daughter may still have those. I do not know. Donald lived to be 100 years old. I remember that going to an anniversary with him and his wife. I think it was their 70th anniversary. And that was a wonderful occasion. It was many years later.
And you went to high school here as well?
I did not. I went to McDonough, which was a military school then. And I graduated from McDonough in 1953.
Do you remember what downtown was like when you were a youngster?
Yes, it was like it is today. Washington and St. John Streets essentially have the same buildings that they have today. Ownership has changed of most of the buildings, but the physical buildings themselves are virtually the same as they were back in 1940 or 41, which is my earliest recollection. For example, I recall Lyons Pharmacy back in that time, and it was the same as it is today. I recall Gall's Bakery then. I recall Joseph's Department Store. We always called it $1.98. He had a sign up, $1.98 Joe Cutlery. I don't recall Dominic's Barber Shop, but it goes back to 1934 also. I started going to Dominic later, in the late 40s, and knew him. Of course, he has passed away. His son, Donato, Don, and now has the barber shop. Don's 80 years old, and he still runs the barber shop every day except Wednesday.
Now, do you remember like a social life, like dances or going downtown with friends on a Friday night or going to the movie or anything like that?
I don't recall any dances. I recall going to the movies on Saturday. It cost 17 cents. And for a while, my father, when I was very young, my father paid another young man to take me to the movies every Saturday, which was near my father's real estate office. We would go there and get the money and go to movies. I remember going to Foley's Drug Store, which is across the street from where my father's real estate business was, on the same side of the street as Dominic's barber shop.
So there was a Foley's Drug Store and a Lyons Pharmacy, both on that side of the street?
That's correct.
Okay.
There was also a Green's Pharmacy, which was on Washington Street, up next to where La Cucina is now.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Anything about segregation or anything like that?
Well, the schools were segregated. I never went to school with a black person until I went to Cornell in 1953, and there were a few black students there. When I went to Havre de Grace, it was all white, and there was a black consolidated school over on Stoke Street. Physical school building still exists there, and I knew that was for black students. Then when I was at McDonough, that was also segregated. Brown versus Topeka Board of Education was decided in 1954. At the time, I thought it was wrongly decided. I changed my mind within a very short time thereafter. I think it was absolutely correct decision by Justice Warren and the other members of the Supreme Court, and was one of the major decisions that the Supreme Court has ever rendered.
Do you remember any moments when there was a new technology that had an effect, like a TV or phones or?
Oh, certainly. When we first went to live in Charlestown in the summer, we used an outhouse. My father put in indoor plumbing within about a year, and I don't think I ever had to use the outdoor outhouse again, except when I went hunting, usually out of state. I remember television coming in the early, well, in the mid-1940s, around 46 or 47, with black and white. I remember people like Milton Berle who were on television. Pretty awful, but he had quite a following at that time. And Ed Sullivan had a show. He was pretty awful, but he had quite a following also. One thing I haven't mentioned is the fishing around Havre de Grace. When I was growing up, there were great runs of shad and herring that came up the bay and up the Susquehanna River and were caught by nets and by hook and line by fishermen. I later had some very nice days fishing for shad off of Garrett Island and around Garrett Island. There were wonderful fish to catch, and there were a lot of people who were fishing. There might have been 50 or 100 boats out there.
Wow.
Rockfish also came up, and I recall fishing for them between Havre de Grace and Perry Point and down below here, and also up the river between Lapidum and Port Deposit. And these were wonderful fish to catch, and they were even better to eat. And my father and I went, one of the few times my father liked to go fishing, and we went sometimes with Johnny Hines, who was a local painter and had a boat, and with Elmer Simpers, who had a boat that he took people out on. Later I had my own larger boat, and I caught fish off of that. And in recent years I've always had a fishing boat. I have one now down at Tidewater Marina. I represent Tidewater Marina also, and have fished with Gary Pencil, who used to have the majority interest in Tidewater. I've fished with his son, Garrett Pencil. But the rock fishing in recent years has tailed off, and it's not near as good today, except some days in the spring. I had a couple of days, more than a few days last spring with my son Dan. We did very well catching and releasing rockfish off of Parrot Point.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember going to the racetrack at all?
Yes. Well, I only went to the races once or twice out at Havre de Grace track. I remember being taken one time when there was a walkover. Coaltown won the race. The walkover was where there were no other horses, just one horse went around the track. And Coaltown was a well-known horse. He won that race, as I recall. I also remember being at the track on at least one other occasion.
Do you remember any stories or experiences specific to World War II?
I remember when World War II started. My father and mother had gone to California by car to visit my grandfather, Carson. And the day they came back was Pearl Harbor Day. It was December 7, 1941. And they had stopped at my aunt's house up in Darlington. Her name was Edith Monroe, my father's oldest sister. And when they got back to town, they told me, or my Aunt Libby told me, about World War II beginning. And I knew that about it because of that. My Aunt Libby had kept me when my parents were away in California.
Do you remember any experiences from school, or, like, for instance, when I was in school, I remember hiding under our desk for air raid drills.
Well, I remember that in high school they put tape on the windows. This is an elementary school. In elementary school, to make sure that the windows didn't crack and break. This was because of the tremendous amount of explosions that took place at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where they were testing munitions for the Army and for the armed services. And you could hear those from the proving ground. And they were quite common. I would say they would probably have been an everyday occurrence. When the first Iranian war began, I remember that they were again testing a lot of munitions. And Gary Pencil and I were fishing right off a proving ground. We were stopped by a Aberdeen Proving Ground vessel, Army vessel, and they boarded us and made sure that we weren't terrorists.
Wow. That must have been quite an experience.
And we were told to get out of that area.
Uh-huh. Sneaking around where you're not supposed to be, huh?
Yeah.
In your upbringing, in your long life, what words of wisdom might you have to pass on?
Well, that's hard to say. I think it's very important for young people to get a good education. My granddaughter is now going to Towson University, and she's in her third year. And she was at Harford Community before. She was at Dean's List continuously there. She was continuously Dean's List at Harford, at John Carroll. And I'm sure she will be at Towson University. I think that's extremely important. Daughter is a graduate from Virginia Tech in forestry and wildlife. She does antiques. My son Warren had a degree from Towson, I think in psychology. He did roofing. My son Warren passed away 20 years ago. He had a problem with drug addiction. My son Danny only has a Harford Community College degree, but he's done very well in real estate. My son Duke has a degree from Gettysburg in religion. He's presently not employed. I think it's very important that young people get as much education, and good education, as they can. I think that's important. And I think it's important to be involved in community affairs. Most people are not, but I think it's extremely important. And with the national scene the way it is, my daughter, I know, is involving herself with political matters and trying to be involved with groups who will support what she thinks to be a correct view of the world, which is very important that they be involved politically also.
Thanks, Bob. The full-length interview for Robert Bob Carson is available by subscription on our website. He talks about his education, being a delegate of the Maryland Constitutional Convention in 1967-68, and a bit more of his memories of growing up and living in Havre de Grace. Please visit our website at hdgstories.com for more podcasts, to join our mail list, or even consider a paid membership. We're also available on iTunes at Havre de Grace Stories and on YouTube at HDG Stories. Till our next podcast, have a great week.
We hope you've enjoyed today's HDG Stories podcast. We encourage you to subscribe. We hope you will share with your friends. Till the next story, we invite you to visit us at hdgstories.com.